Hi, my name's Kirstie Page, and in the last of these CPD recordings attached to CPD Newsletter 5, I want to talk a little bit about things to consider and think about when it comes to children that we class as non-verbal. And non-verbal is a term that I hear used by teachers and practitioners nowadays more than way back when I was a speech and language therapist. And I think that's for two reasons. I think nowadays people have more of an understanding of speech, language, and communication terminology, but also because anecdotally people will share their concerns about the number of children that seem to be starting early years settings who are termed as being non-verbal. So I think understanding and knowing, and of course you will know that a child isn't using verbal communication, should I say, is really useful, particularly once they've moved beyond that age where every child is different. Some children are early talkers, some children are late talkers, but certainly by now we would have expected a child to be beginning to use single words and moving on from that point. It is very good to characterize that a child hasn't moved on to that level. But at this point, the term, in my opinion, loses value. All we're doing is saying this child, along with other children, where we're using the same term and the same terminology, all we're saying, and if we've got Launchpad, all we're saying is this child isn't yet using verbal communication, which is right down here on the expressive language skills strand. But what the term doesn't do is tell me why. It doesn't tell me what gaps are acting as the main barriers, and it doesn't also tell me what the child also has as strengths. And most importantly, the term non-verbal doesn't tell me or my team what it is that we actually need to do to support that child and to move that child onto their next steps. And as I've said in the newsletter, in a cohort, we could have 4 children who were classifying as being non-verbal, but those 4 children could all be non-verbal for completely different reasons and could also need, and because of that, will need 4 completely different things. So the strategies that me and my team need to weave into our interactions and into our learning environment for those 4 children could be 4 completely different things. So this is where, using that term to group those children together is only useful at a level. To work out what I need to do to support that child and what I need to do to upskill myself and my team to support that child is I have to begin to think about those children as individuals. Now, as children get older, certain teachers and practitioners feel slightly de-skilled because a child isn't talking, because usually once children are older and once a child can talk, we use talk as a real strong measure of speech, language and communication. We listen to what children say to find out what they're thinking, to find out what they know, to find out what they want. And sometimes when children aren't offering any language, because we're very concerned about that child, we also feel a little bit de-skilled ourselves, because it's like we don't have our normal vehicle for assessment. But actually, if we go back to the detail of speech, language, and communication development, if we go back to the skill flow idea that we talked about earlier in this CPD newsletter 5, we have actually got all of the skills that we need to work out what it is that we need to focus our efforts on. Now, of course, any slightly older or much older child who is being labelled as non-verbal will be a priority for referral. They will probably already be known to speech and language therapists or other outside agencies. So it goes without saying that if you're watching this recording and if you're reading these newsletters, you always want to go with what that professional who has actually met that child, observed and assessed that child, is saying to you about that child, with your own professional judgment there as well. And I suppose what I am talking to you about is upskilling yourself with that professional judgment so that you can kind of think about what the main gap is from your point of view as well. But certainly take what that other person is saying about a child over what I am saying here. But I do think it's important that we understand the principles that we can use for all children. And really, I'm going back to that notion of skill flow. I know that the child's output isn't verbal, but I want to go right back to the beginning of that communication and speech and language journey. We say speech, language, and communication, but actually, from a skill flow point of view, it should be the other way round. We should be talking about communication, language, and speech, because actually, speech up here, because that's actually the notion of skill flow. So when I've got a child who is being labelled as non-verbal, again, I want to ask myself that question. Has that child got those very early communication skills in place? Are they tuning into me, my voice, my face? Are they demonstrating two-way communication? If they are using non-verbal communication, are they using that in a two-way? Are they communicating with intent? Are they communicating with me on purpose? So if a child is tapping me on the shoulder and then pointing to somewhere, are their communication skills established? Absolutely they are. But if a child's communication skills aren't established, that's what I need to work on. So it might be that I work on very simple turn taking. It might be that I work on things like peekaboo to get that face-to-face engagement. It might be that I use high interest resources and leave gaps. And again, there's some more CPD on YouTube around this. And of course, for those of you with Launchpad, there's a lot of support within the toolkit around this. But again, it's this idea of, is the biggest barrier to this verbal communication actually the child's communication? And alongside that, as always, I'm going to look at their play, their early play, and particularly looking for and facilitating and supporting that emerging simple language-based play. And again, I'm going to then, even if those skills are established, I'm going to be looking at listening and understanding next. So I look at communication first, and then I begin to look at listening and language. First of all, looking at input of language before I consider output of language. But for these children, we kind of already know about that output of language. But also it's interesting to work out whether the child is using noises and sounds to communicate. Is there any babble? Are there any use of symbolic noises like brum brum as they play? Or is that child very silent? But as we begin to think about listening and understanding. That's really important, because I'm thinking about a child when I taught in nursery who was classified, who was labelled as non-verbal. And this was a child who very much had non-verbal communication and wanted to communicate with me. And so it was really, really easy to think, oh, wow, he's really communicative. The gap is just with the expressive language. But actually, when you looked at Ben's skills, he was able to understand more than he was able to say, but only a little bit more. His understanding of language was actually really quite delayed, but because he was so communicative, people were lulled into that feeling that he understood more than he did and that he just couldn't say it. And we did a lot of work going back with the level of language that we were adding, really simplifying it right down, adding shorter chunks, being more repetitive, so saying the same words again and again and again, rather than trying to talk about too much at once. And we found that made a huge difference to him, because it was actually his understanding of language that was impacting on his ability to move on with his expressive language. Now, of course, there are some children who have got some very specific expressive language issues, and some children who have very specific speech, sound, or oromotor issues. But for many children, the gap will begin with communication and with language. And if you've got a child with oromotor issues or very kind of specific things, then it will be your outside agency person who will give you exact advice specific to that child. But I suppose what I want us to do is to empower ourselves to kind of move away from that umbrella label of non-verbal, to actually see this as a child with either very early levels of success and emerging skills, but even if you've got a child with a very specific difficulty, to empower ourselves to understand that there is a lot we can think about and there's a lot we can do. We just need to match our efforts and what we do to the thing that will make the biggest difference for that child. And I think that's what it's all about. And so we need to move away from that generic non-verbal label to kind of say, right, okay, but what does this child actually need? What do we need to put in place? So there's lots to think about, but I think there's so much we can do if we go back to our knowledge and understanding of not speech, language and communication development, but communication, language and speech development, and then beginning to think about what is the main gap that's acting as a barrier for this child. Thank you for your time.